Thank you for coming to our event on the future of clean energy. It is my distinct pleasure and my honor to introduce the Senator from Wyoming, Barrasso, who was re-elected by the staggering margin of 2/3, 67%. He is the third-ranking Republican in the leadership as head of the conference. He is a fabulous policy mind. We're delighted he's chosen to open the event with his remarks. Senator.
Well, thanks, Doug. It's wonderful to be here. I really appreciate, Doug, what you have done, what the American Action Forum has done, and thanks for hosting this event. Doug has been a long-time friend, and whenever I need really accurate numbers, I go and turn to Doug, because he gives it to you straight, always has. I want to thank you for organizing this event and for your recent work assessing the cost of the Green New Deal. Doug and his team's report provides an important benchmark for the plan's staggering costs. Because when I look at it, the cost of this would really, and trying to play it out, it would drive a stake through the heart of our strong, healthy, and growing economy. We have an economy that people across the country are very proud of. In just 2 years, America has created 5 million new jobs. 3 million since we signed tax reform and we passed tax relief for American. People are really seeing it. I hear in Wyoming, I was home this past weekend, more money in their pockets, more money in their paychecks. Wages are up by 3%, the highest jump in over a decade. 600,000 of these jobs have been in manufacturing, which is astonishing. I mean, remember President Obama saying that there's no way that manufacturing jobs are going to be back in America. I think this is the largest jump in manufacturing jobs last year in over 20 years. The problem is this Green New Deal would take us in an opposite direction. This is the proposal that has been made that would wipe out the historic gains that we've had all across the economy and across the country. So much, I believe, of the growth that we've had economically has been in energy. Energy is called the master resource for a reason. It powers our economy, it powers our military, it powers our country. It's an instrument of power, it's a force multiplier. And of course, it's a geopolitical weapon. Vladimir Putin uses it as such. I was in Germany for the Munich Defense Conference a week ago, and what we saw is energy poverty in Germany. Costs are up, and now they're doing this Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia so that they get natural gas additional from Russia, which has them further dependent upon Russia, which is a cost to their own freedom. That's how Vladimir Putin uses his energy. So I think that the Green New Deal would be a raw deal for America, for American families, and for American businesses. The far left would drive our economy right over the cliff. Of course, if you read through the 14 pages, it's full of government giveaways, free housing, free college, free health care, free salaries. It's going to require every homeowner to retrofit their home, and it would spike energy bills. I mean, all of these things are things that the American public is not going to want. It would try to transform how Americans travel. At the heart of the Green Deal is a goal to switch to renewable energy sources completely. This would eliminate the abundant and affordable fuels that we use every day. They currently provide power to 3 out of every 5 homes in America. In 2017, wind and solar, they generated about 8% of Americans' electricity. 8%. So there is a gap. There's a huge gap between the renewable energy that we have and the reliable energy that we need to power our communities, to power our country. I think we really do need to increase our use of renewables, but outlawing other sources of energy, oil, gas, coal, I think it's a mistake. Plus, it really is impossible. The new Green Deal, as I said, would just give such a gift to Vladimir Putin for us to become more dependent, greater need for energy, paying money to the Middle East, to Russia, others. I mean, you see when Boston has to bring in a tanker of LNG from Russia because we don't have the pipeline capacity, and they brought that into Boston because we don't have the pipeline capacity to get American gas there, tells you how important energy is. That happened at the coldest point of the winter last year. So when I take a look, Doug, at your report, the American Action Report, it's the first that I can find, the first full cost analysis of the Green New Deal's government mandates and social welfare program. The report confirms the plan would cost American taxpayers tens of trillions of dollars. And sometimes people, it's interesting listening to people talk, and sometimes they get confused. Millions and billions and trillions, as the words come out of their mouth. This is trillions with a T. And you kind of think like what a million is, and then 1,000 millions is a billion, and then 1,000 billions is a trillion. And Doug, this is up to 93 trillion with a T dollars. It's you take a look and then break it down, about $3,900 per family in increased electricity costs, a couple thousand annually per household to overhaul transportation system, $32,000 annually per household for the guaranteed job program that are union jobs according to the new Green Deal, the $26,000 annually per household for Medicare for all. So the whole cost of this is about 3 times the total cost of Medicare for all, which we can't afford either. But for every household in America, it would cost somewhere between $36,000 and $65,000 a year. I mean, cumulatively, the cost of this is like 90% of the entire amount of value of all of the citizens of this country. You take a look what is the net worth of all of the citizens of the country. You can find that number through the Federal Reserve. And the number this is going to cost, Doug, is 90% of the total net worth of America. So that just doesn't seem to matter much to those people who proposed it. From the Senate standpoint, we had 11 Senate co-sponsors, many of whom are running for president, and by the time it's over, they may all be running for president. So we are leading the world right now. I mean, this is the point of this. We are leading the world right now in the United States in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. You take a look at how much carbon dioxide emissions have been dropping over the last 10 years. It's double digits in the United States compared to other places around the world. And for people who propose this for the United States, only 13% of emissions of the world are coming from the United States, 33% from China and from India. So even if you were to turn off the United States completely, emissions globally are going to continue to go up. So the Green New Deal is not the answer. Even if you put the entire plan into practice, the effects of the climate would be negligible, and emissions will continue to rise. So, somebody said to me today as I was coming over from our policy lunch, well, why don't the Republicans propose anything? Well, actually, we have. We propose things that actually work. And it's not just my saying what we're proposing is the right approach, but Obama's Energy Secretary Moniz has said that we ought to go in the direction of the things that I'm talking about. It had an editorial in the New York Times in December about the things that we ought to be doing to address the issues of carbon dioxide and climate change. And I think we have a responsibility to do something. We need to do something that actually is going to work and make a difference and can be deployed globally. So what we're doing is promoting innovation, development of and focus on ways to best use our resources. There's a program now at the University of Wyoming, an integrated test center, where we're capturing carbon dioxide, using it for sequestering, put it in the ground, also using it innovatively for creating products for construction, for medication, for medical reasons, actually to go and make carbon of great value. There's new technology not just to capture carbon dioxide right there at the source at a coal-fired power plant, but also to capture it from the atmosphere. So there's a lot of technology that's out there that can be used to capture carbon. The other is the largest zero emission source of energy that's scalable is nuclear power. And Bill Gates has been working on this a number of years. If you read his annual newsletter that he and Melinda put out every year about the important things that are happening around the world in terms of fighting disease, in terms of medication, and he talks about climate change. And he talks about the newest technology in nuclear power. He's been investing in this, working in it, and we have bipartisan legislation that's done it. Sheldon Whitehouse and I have partnered in ways on a piece of nuclear energy legislation that President Trump signed into law in January. We've done things with carbon capture, 45Q. That has been passed and signed into law. We're having a hearing tomorrow on the Environment and Public Works Committee on something called the Use It Act, in ways to capture carbon and the pipelines and the permitting to be able to move it. So we are committed to dealing with the issues of climate change and coming up with something that actually can make a difference globally, not something that's going to hurt our country, hurt our economy, and put us at a disadvantage to Vladimir Putin and Russia and his view of the world. Energy, in so many ways, is freedom. President Trump had talked in the past about moving from energy security to energy dominance. We are at a point now, we have the resources, we have the technological ability, we have the manpower, we have the thought process to do it, continue to maintain our energy focus and a strong, healthy, and growing economy, and this Green New Deal. So I'm going to do everything I can to defeat it, to focus and fight against it, and to make sure that the American people know what's in it. And as the Democrats who have all signed on to this and have taken this hard left turn of hijacking the economy and our energy successes continue on their way, I want to make sure that the American people know what the impact is on their lives. And Doug, the research that you have done that highlights the cost of what may at first blush to some people seem tempting to want to support, they'll realize that it's not for them and it's a big green bomb. Thanks so much for doing it. Thanks for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, Senator. At this time, I'd like to invite the panel and to come up and take this opportunity to thank Adam Shapiro for his willingness to moderate the panel. Adam is a journalist with Yahoo Finance, has previously spent time at both Fox News and Fox Business and earned an Emmy Award in the process. But his most outstanding characteristic is he graduated from Syracuse University at a time when I was on the faculty. So, Adam, thank you.
And I didn't take his class. For the record, I recycle, but I also have a soft spot for a 2011 Jaguar with a V8 engine. Our panel today includes Philip Rossetti, the Director of Energy Policy from the American Action Forum, Nick Loris, Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow in Energy and Environmental Policy, Center for Free Markets and Regulatory Reform at the Heritage Foundation, and Dr. Adele Morris, Senior Fellow for Economic Studies and Policy Director for the Climate and Energy Economics Project at the Brookings Institution. Let me start with you, Dr. Morris. I want to read something that I believe is attributed to you. Quote, "Markets need durable guidance for investment in cleaner power generation, industrial facilities, and vehicle fleets. Investors need long-run signals to develop new, low-cost, lower-emitting technologies, which will be essential to drive abatement in the developing world where emissions are projected to grow the most." Two things I want to ask you about that quote. Are you agreeing with Senator Barrasso that the United States is taking the right steps and that we are cutting our greenhouse emissions at a pace in which we don't need regulation? And the second is the back and forth between administrations and policy on greenhouse emissions and climate change causing confusion in the marketplace, which might actually slow down our cleaning up the environment.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank the American Action Forum for inviting me to participate in this panel. It's great to see you all here. I think that does sound like me, actually. So yeah, good quote, whoever it was. I think the United States is leaving unaddressed an enormous market failure. We have clear evidence of the damages of the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And leaving, we basically have no policy right now across the economy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce the buildup of our contribution to those atmospheric concentrations. So I think we really have to start with the mitigation policy. The technology policy will follow in part because when you price the emissions that are damaging the Earth's climate, the private sector will follow the profit motive. Thankfully, we harness the profit motive very well in the United States. And so the remaining challenge, I think, is to ensure that our research and development policies backfill where there's really basic science, basic research that would not be fully funded by private sector activity. So while I do think there's a case to be made for policies to encourage research and development in clean energy, it is not a substitute for fully incorporating the costs of climate change into the prices of emitting goods and services.
Is Senator Barrasso correct, though, when he talks about the United States being in the lead?
Well, I mean, in what regard? I mean, we have certainly the deepest, richest, most liquid capital markets on the face of the earth. What we need to do is harness those to the benefit of the environment. And no, we have not done that yet. So we're in the potential lead, but have we actually undertaken the policies that will produce the technologies that are going to be necessary, not just in the United States, but around the world? No, we have not done that.
Nick, believe that Heritage Foundation just put out a new report. Regulatory reform is the key to unlocking infrastructure investment. And you wrote, or at least the report says, political interventions destroy investment confidence in the face of ever-changing and arbitrary political winds. Top-down, tax and spend approaches are inefficient, politically driven, and result in poor infrastructure outcomes that are not aligned with real needs. But as Senator Barrasso pointed out, we are meeting, at least halfway to meeting the 2025 targets under what had been our participation in the Paris Climate Accords, and that was kind of top-down, wasn't it?
Partially, but if you look at, I think, what have been some of the economic and environmental failures, they have come from this aggregation of politicians and lobbyists deciding who produces what. It gets you high-speed rail, it gets you Solyndras, and in many instances it gets you elements of corporate welfare that the Green New Deal is purportedly against, where you have loan guarantees going to huge companies that have huge market caps and shouldn't need any help from the taxpayer to finance these projects. So in that regard, I think what we tried to get at with that paper is that yes, we live in an era of energy abundance, and yes, we need more critical infrastructure, but there are a number of policy barriers that are discouraging investment in clean technologies, whether that's new nuclear plants, whether that's renewables. There's all sorts of energy infrastructure and needs that could be met with better free market technologies that allow these projects to come online, to not be held up in litigation, and to freely trade these technologies without costs of tariffs and things of that nature.
We're going to come back to all of this, but Philip, I believe that in a comparison of the effectiveness of climate regulation versus tax policy, the AAF paper said, quote, taxes can capture a broader base of consumers and can encourage efficient opportunities for behavioral change. Carbon taxes also tend to be administratively simpler to implement than regulations. Didn't they have kind of a big problem in Europe, though, with the carbon taxes? Has it failed over there?
So when we think about Europe's approach, they have a cap and trade which is very similar to a carbon tax. It hasn't been as efficient as it could be, but these policies rarely are, because we think about the ordering of the best use of revenues, and it almost never enters into the final proposal. But if we're actually looking at a market mechanism and saying, like, okay, we compare this to the sort of carbon tax we have now, which is regulations, we know that it's more efficient because it sends an economy-wide signal instead of narrowly targeting opportunities for abatement.
So I don't think that it's a monopoly of Republicans or Democrats wanting to protect the environment. But the simple question is, what is the best way to get us there? Would it be through regulation, or would it be through a simple tax on all of us on carbon? The French protests were in regards to an increase in the fuel tax. Would Americans be willing to go there?
So the French protests on the fuel tax, I think it's important to think about how that's different from the sort of proposal that we see in the US from a revenue neutral carbon tax. So if you're just going to say we're going to tax energy, we're going to tax fuel consumption, obviously that's not going to help people at the bottom level. You're increasing the cost that they use every day. The proposals that get talked about a lot more in sort of a potentially bipartisan way is we already have a lot of taxes. We have a lot of inefficiencies in our tax code. What is the difference in inefficiencies if you have a carbon tax and you use that revenue to cut other taxes like payroll taxes or corporate income taxes? And then your economic harm is isolated to the difference in harm that you get from those two taxes. Achieving that and getting to the proposal is really complicated, but I think it's pretty clear that that's more efficient than a regulatory approach.
Nick?
You know, I think the devil's in the details, and a lot of times I think economists like to estimate what that social cost of carbon might look like, and then try to create some tax based on that social cost of carbon, but even coming up with a social cost of carbon figure is subject to a lot of subjectivity in terms of looking at different discount rates, looking at equilibrium climate sensitivities. You see that the models that the federal government uses to try to calculate a social cost of carbon produce highly different results based on just pretty simple changes to discount rates and ECS distributions. So one, trying to figure out what that magic number looks like is difficult. And then in practice, I think it's still subject to the same public choice problems that a lot of other climate policies have been subjected to, whether it's been cap and trade or regulation. You see similar types of rent seeking going on in places like Washington State when they tried to pass a carbon tax, and a lot of the environmental groups did not support that carbon tax because the revenue was not allocated toward renewable energy companies. And then if you talk about border adjustments, then you get into a whole nother set of mechanisms and government trying to decide where that tax is allocated. And there's a whole number of different supply chains and chains as to how that tax could be allocated. So you're introducing a whole new level of bureaucracy potentially that could undermine a lot of those efficiencies you allegedly get from a carbon tax.
Dr. Morris, you pointed out that the Trump administration has revised the social cost of carbon downward. Do you think that we will see a negative impact with the rate at which we are decreasing our greenhouse gases in the near future? Will the rate slow at which we're decreasing?
Not because of their change in the methodology for analyzing regulations. The Trump administration is basically in the process of undoing almost every climate initiative that the Obama administration brought forward. I think the lesson there is if you care about climate, don't rely on existing regulatory authority. I think it's really important to take from watching this process of unraveling years of regulatory effort by the Obama administration to say, look, that's not going to be the way we actually address climate change in the United States because it's so vulnerable to the priorities of the White House. So what are we going to do instead? I mean, even if you liked the regulatory authority, it's not going to work. So what are we going to do instead? And I'm absolutely 100% convinced we need new bipartisan, broad, economy-wide climate change legislation. And the more economically efficient we can make it, the more fair, the more thoughtful we can make it, the longer it's going to persist, it's going to provide important incentives to reduce emissions, not just now, but over the long term. And that's really how you solve the climate challenge. I want to be sure we take from the events in France the right lesson. Let's be clear, fuel prices were already over $6 a gallon in France, and they were talking about adding to that new significant taxes. And this is in a time and place where there's not a lot of necessarily public transport alternatives or alternative vehicle technologies. Where I think it's important is to be careful that when you do adopt a price on carbon, you're mindful of the impacts on people across your economy. And where there are disproportionate burdens, you address those, and where you're concerned about, like jump discontinuity in prices, you take that into account. And a perfect example to me is the bill that Representative Carlos Curbelo put out last year, Republican member of Congress with Republican co-sponsors, and that very carefully thought through what the impact would be on vehicle transport fuels. And it was actually, I think, a very clever design. It would have, that kind of approach would have greatly ameliorated any of the kind of tension created in the French context.
So how do you get the people in this room, myself, who are not experts perhaps in the terminologies that the three of you are comfortable using, to buy into whatever change needs to take place? Especially when I stood, we were talking about this, was it 9 years ago, when they broke ground on the train to nowhere in California. I was in the Central Valley, and that might have been a Jobs Act, but it was touted as a green transportation measure. How do you get the public to buy into all of this when they see something like that, which has just been canceled in California?
Well, I think you have to make sure that what you're doing with the taxpayer resources makes sense to them. I mean, let's just stipulate we want to do something about greenhouse gas emissions, and we want to reduce them, and we want to have policies that are cost-effective and fair. If you start from that stipulation, a lot of design policy features naturally follow. One is you need to cover as much of the greenhouse gas emissions in the United States as possible. You don't pick sectors, you don't pick specific industries, and you don't pick specific sources if you can cover those sensibly with a broad policy. And I think, you know, just walking people through the logic of start from your goals and really look for the best economic choices through the whole policy process. You know, that's what I've been doing all day, and I have a stack of peer-reviewed research that's ready to support that conversation. So when you all are ready to have that policy discussions, please let me know. I will be on your doorstep with more research, data, and analysis than you ever thought existed, and would be more than happy to help you understand the pros and cons of different options and help you design something that would really work.
Nick, I'm curious, because isn't that the problem that government gets into, though? It constantly picks winners and losers, and it doesn't approach it the way Dr. Morris has just said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, part of that challenge is finding a way to do it in a cost-effective manner. I mean, if you think about what a recent AP poll said, that 68% of Americans weren't willing to pay an additional $10 a month in their electricity bill to combat climate change. And you think of things like the Green New Deal or even older types of legislation like cap and trade that had higher costs than that. These policies are not very politically appealing, and they're not appealing to their constituents. I think that's part of the reason why you saw the House flip. And so I think the pivoting to innovation that is technology neutral and competition among energy sources that is technology and energy source neutral is critically important, because people don't like energy cronyism, they don't like corporate welfare, they don't like subsidies for big oil or big coal or natural gas, they don't need them. We don't need subsidies for nuclear. What we need are policy avenues that allow different types of energy technologies to compete in a market. So we need to fix things like an antiquated nuclear regulatory commission that only is focused on licensing large light water reactors. We need more electricity choice competition like we have in Texas, where renewables are thriving, and part of that is driven by subsidies like the wind production tax credit, but you're seeing a lot of investment in renewables because consumers are demanding them. And I think if you have that consumer choice element as a part of the solution, whether it's business choice and companies like Apple and Google investing in renewables and clean tech, and you have consumers demanding it, and you provide those policy pathways for producers to respond to those demands, then you get changes at pretty significant levels.
Phil, can we scale up the renewables fast enough to meet the current demand and then to grow demand? From a journalist perspective, I'm always hearing that the majority is still from coal, and that's going to be another 20, 30 years that coal is going to be generating our electricity. Correct me.
So I wouldn't say purely from coal. The Energy Information Administration, which does these nonpartisan outlook reports, they show that even by 2050, we're still going to be using a lot of natural gas and to a lesser extent coal, but not as much as we're using now. But no matter how you cut it, you still have a lot of fossil fuels on the grid. In terms of scaling up renewables, the challenge that gets lost in the discussion a lot is the dispatchability problem. Right? Solar is only going to be functional when the sun is shining, when the wind is blowing. The capacity factors, which is basically the percent of the day that it's actually generating the amount of electricity it says, it's about 27% for solar, 30-odd% for wind. You need a lot of storage to cover that difference. There was a study last year that said you need about 12 hours of grid storage, and that's where you run into these problems with renewables. Storage is really expensive, even when renewables are really cheap. So having a more market-oriented approach, I think, is how you get create an incentive to find solutions to that problem, bring the storage costs down. What Nick hit upon with sort of the market choice dynamics in Texas is, I think, really important, because that's an example of an area where people are able to choose how they want to get their electricity. There's a lot more competition at the retail level than you see everywhere else. And a lot of states still have what they call a cost of service model, where it's just directed, regulated. This is your utility provider, and they're going to recover their costs of that. The Texas model has an incentive to actually produce more storage, produce better resources, things that consumers value. The other model just says whatever we can justify at a cost, and no incentive for better scalability.
Any one of you can jump in on this and then follow up. But Senator Barrasso brought up nuclear energy, and I can't think, when I was in Washington in 07-08, this was a discussion, and what people would point out is that most of the new nuclear projects go bankrupt, and that taxpayers wind up being on the hook. Forget that we still don't have an outlet for the waste that is produced from nuclear energy. So why is nuclear energy considered a viable portion of this discussion?
Well, I'll jump in on the nuclear. So I don't have any problems with nuclear per se. I think just the economics are really against, big scale new nuclear. And here's why. Right now, with natural gas prices as low as they are, and the ease with which you can site new combined cycle, very efficient natural gas units, and the rate at which you can put new renewables online, nuclear is just not going to be competitive. New nuclear is not going to be competitive, because what happens is you get $1 billion of construction costs tied up for 10 years before you produce your first kilowatt hour. That's just a lot of capital at risk for a long period of time with no return, and you compare that to just swift deployment of new natural gas capacity. So I just don't see nuclear competing, even if you did all the things that Nick was just talking about in terms of easing the regulatory process. I just don't think it's going to be competitive. What I do think is important is where we have installed nuclear, it's important to keep that online as long as is feasible, because we're going to need that zero carbon capacity if we're going to deeply decarbonize the power sector. So you're going to see coal come out of the power sector quite rapidly. If we have anything that looks like a efficient climate policy, coal basically, it's the most carbon intensive fuel, and it has lots of lower carbon competitors. So coal really does come out of the power sector quickly. And then you've got to manage the integration of more renewables and the natural gas, and eventually you're going to have to find a way to decarbonize even with the natural gas, whether it's gas with CCS or more renewables with storage. While I'm on that thought though, because we know with very high certainty that coal is going to be disproportionately reduced with a cost-effective climate policy, we should be thinking about how we're going to help the folks in coal country transition to a different economic base, and we should be talking a little bit more about the disproportionate burdens of achieving our climate goals. So that's one of my research areas right now, is thinking how we can be mindful of those concerns.
I think with regard to nuclear, Dr. Morris may very well be right. I don't know if we'll see especially large light water reactors being built anytime soon. But I think cheap natural gas has become an excuse for policy laziness in that we don't have a regulatory environment that allows for the build of new nuclear plants. Right now, again, you have a nuclear regulatory commission that's so focused on trying to license and permit these large light water reactors, and you have all of these new innovative small modular reactor technologies that may not be providing as much power as the large light water guys, but they might be economically competitive, not just in the United States, but around the world. And you have the NRC saying, come back in 6 to 8 years, we're having a hard enough time trying to license and permit the bigger guys. And so the VC funding for a lot of these small modular reactor technologies just goes out the window, or like Bill Gates decides to go to China. And so I think that's a problem. I think you have low-dose radiation standards that were put in place after Fukushima that are aggressively high and don't jive well with the science of what actually is safe low-dose radiation standards that could be corrected and would allow for some of these SMRs to be more economically cost efficient. And then I think the waste issue is a big part of it. Right now, the federal government said they were going to take hold of this spent nuclear fuel, and they're statutorily obligated to do so, and they have not collected an atom of waste. And so now the nuclear companies are suing them, or have sued them, I should say, and essentially, we as taxpayers are paying the nuclear companies for their inability to fulfill their statutory obligation, where if you look at other places like Finland, where the nuclear companies are actually responsible and pay for and manage the waste, with the government taking the long-term liability, then you have a system that actually incentivizes the right behavior. And I think if you fix nuclear waste on the back end, you start and actually properly price it rather than just building a fixed price as what we've done in the past, then you have these SMR companies, these small modular reactor companies, thinking about what their waste streams look like. And if they don't have a waste stream or it's more cost effective, you build in the full cost of nuclear, and you have more competition within the nuclear sector. And again, I think that's critical. If you're worried about reducing emissions, and you can have these SMRs pop up all over the world where energy demand and electricity demand could continue to increase, and you reduce those emissions in places like China and India and reduce their usage of coal, then you start to see some global emissions reductions that people think are actually necessary to make a difference in terms of mitigating global temperatures.
So I think Adele and Nick both gave really good points. So instead of just echoing that, one thing I want to build off of what Nick mentioned is when you think about more nuclear coming online and small modular reactors and these micro reactors and these new technologies, the most promising opportunities are these sort of marginal high-cost generation scenarios where you have somewhere that doesn't have a whole lot of electricity demand, but it's just really expensive to actually get it there. Those are areas where better regulatory structure, electricity markets, having more competitive markets would actually ease that sort of transition and create opportunities where we can say, hey, let's let the market decide. Let's let them define if nuclear is the best choice, or if it's going to be solar and storage, or if it's going to be a natural gas pipeline. And I think that's worthwhile to see.
We're going to take questions from those of you in the audience if you have any in just a second, but I am curious. Is it true that the byproduct in some cases of drilling for natural gas is methane, and that methane actually is worse in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas because it contributes to warming at a factor much greater than carbon dioxide?
Yeah, so there are different greenhouse gases, and methane is CH4. It's one of the greenhouse gases. Its chemical features is that it's more effective at trapping solar radiation per ton of methane than a ton of CO2. So we weight the methane according to how many times more powerful it is as a greenhouse gas than CO2. But now, so yes, if you're in the business of reducing greenhouse gases, you have to be mindful of the upstream methane emissions in the natural gas system and as a byproduct of oil production as well. There are technologies, though, that what we call green completion, which ensures that the engineering of the wells is done in such a way that methane emissions are minimal. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we have oversight and regulation of the oil and gas system, both upstream in the drilling department, but also downstream in the infrastructure, leaky pipelines, both long-distance pipelines and pipelines within urban areas. We need to make sure that we're not inadvertently emitting this very powerful greenhouse gas, and that's part of the overall policy challenge.
Nick, did you want to weigh in on that? Because I thought I was under the impression, possibly incorrectly, that methane was a much bigger problem that gets attention in places like Texas.
Yeah, well, it does, and there's some economic incentive to capture the methane in certain places because you can actually use it for profitable uses. But in areas where they're drilling for a lot of oil and it may not make economic sense, they're flaring it, and so different states are designing different policies, and this gets back to, who is the correct entity to design those policies? Are there different challenges for a place like Texas versus North Dakota versus Pennsylvania? I think that gets into, certainly some federalism issues and some regulatory responses that I think have met the demands of the public in these states where shale processes, are very prevalent. And I think, EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson a while back said very eloquently that, it doesn't have to be a federal level, that states are stepping up and doing a good job responding to concerns of constituents, whether it's methane emissions related or chemical disclosure, whatever the case may be.
Is that true, Philip? Are the states doing a good job stepping up? Because if we're going to be turning more and more to natural gas and more to shale extraction to get natural gas, we're going to have more and more leak of methane, aren't we?
So I'm not going to give a state-by-state evaluation, but I will say that we know that natural gas power plants have about half of the carbon dioxide emissions relative to coal, which is their primary competitor. They're both dispatchable fossil fuel resources. So we're looking at the scale of emissions leakage from natural gas systems, and we measure these things on their carbon dioxide equivalent. So we do weigh that is more potent, but it is less pollution overall. So when you just look at the scope, you're getting far more emissions reductions by replacing coal, even with the increased natural gas infrastructure. And I think it would be a mistake to say, oh, well, we have this new source of emissions, let's put the brakes on this, forgetting that we're actually displacing a lot of incumbent emissions by doing that. So there's a lot of nuance there that I think we just want to be aware of in the policy space.
Would anybody like to ask anybody on the panel a question behind the camera? Go for it.
Yeah, hi, Steve Barrasso with Voice of America. So we are hearing from scientists that basically we have to cut our emissions by 45% by 2030. That's coming up pretty soon. We'd rather not wreck our economy in the process. You all get to be in charge. How do you get there?
Well, I think it's important to adopt policies that are within the bounds of the willingness to pay of the American electorate. I don't think it does us any good to adopt a policy that is then abruptly terminated when there's a change in who controls Congress or the White House. So I think it's really important to stay within those confines. But within those confines, I think we should be sure to get as much bang for our buck as we can. So I just recently co-chaired a major multi-model analysis of various U.S. carbon tax policy designs. This is under the auspices of the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum. We convened 11 major high-quality modeling teams to look at different design options. And in all of our scenarios and across all of the models, we see only this tiny perturbation in U.S. GDP growth, even when we adopt fairly ambitious levels of carbon tax on CO2 from the fossil fuel sector. So I think it's really economically feasible. There's a lot of rhetoric about how a carbon tax or a greenhouse gas tax would wreck the economy. There's absolutely no peer-reviewed evidence that supports that assertion for a well-designed policy. So I think that's where I would start. And then I'm more than happy to fill in the details about how one would use the revenue and how one would manage the distributional outcomes. I think key will be the U.S. leveraging our domestic policy vigorously through a diplomatic process to energize and make possible equivalent policies elsewhere. So my view is the U.S. should be convening finance ministers of the major emitting economies and really having an economic negotiation about our climate ambition, not just the environmental negotiations that you hear so much about. Those are important, but I think it's serious climate policy is economic policy, and we should treat it that way.
Nick or Phil, do you wish to weigh in on this?
You first.
Sure. Well, I would agree that we need to be thinking grand if we want to act in a quick time frame. I would disagree that a carbon tax and cap and trade policies domestically are the right way to go. I think these are policies that do have huge costs to the American people, to energy-intensive manufacturing industries, and to every single household that uses energy. You're not just being hit when your electricity bill comes in the mail or when you pay more at the pump, because energy is such a critical component of everything we make and do. These policies have huge costs to the economy in terms of hundreds of thousands of jobs lost and multiple trillion-dollar hits to the economy. And as Senator Barrasso mentioned, even if the U.S. took aggressive stances on climate policy and implemented these policies, you're talking about mitigating global temperatures a few tenths of a degree Celsius by the turn of the century. So what I look for is a more proactive solution at a global scale focused on technology sharing, whether that's helping other countries develop their shale resources and transitioning away from coal if it's more economically competitive to do so, whether that's making the U.S. a critical supplier of the nuclear chain, whether that's increasing renewables. All of those things together, I think, make a more cost-effective solution that gets people the energy sources that they need, especially when you have more than 1 billion people without access to reliable, affordable power, and does so in a way that continues to grow the economy. I certainly don't think that improving the environment and growing the economy are mutually exclusive, but there are better ways to do it than taxes, regulation, and spending.
So I think I'm going to fall in the middle here. It's first and foremost, we need to think about what is the energy source that actually gets us the abundant demand that there is globally, and is that going to be developed here? So we should be thinking about our innovation agenda, just as Senator Barrasso was talking about. In light of that, we also need to think about, okay, if we invent something great, how quickly can it get to market? What are the roadblocks to that? I think that's where I would agree along with Nick that there are a lot of roadblocks in our regulatory schema. It takes a long time to get a nuclear power plant to market. It takes a long time to get any new technology to market, for that matter. So we should think about commercialization efforts. But I also think Adele is right to point out that you need a market incentive. And pricing pollution is a way of delivering an immediate incentive to everyone to say, oh, I can actually make more money if I pollute less. And that's something that helps a lot with the timing, in my view. I can't say specifically to what degree, but if you have all three of those, you're going to allow the dynamism of the market to come up with a solution. Doug?
Yeah, a lot of times, thanks. A lot of times in this discussion, the key for coordinating policy across countries is this notion of border adjustment. And we just went through a debate over tax reform that featured border adjustment in the tax code. It was widely vilified and ultimately dropped. And so my questions are twofold. Number one, do you need border adjustment in some sort of carbon policy? And if you do, how do you avoid a repetition of what we just saw in the debate over the tax bill?
Well, I can address that. I have a couple papers out. One is a modeling paper looking at border carbon adjustments in that same study I was just describing in the March issue of Climate Change Economics, a peer-reviewed journal. And I also have another paper called Making Border Carbon Adjustments Work in Law and Practice, where I really look through, well, how would you articulate such a policy in a carbon tax bill? I think the answer is focusing very strictly on those industries and products that are very vulnerable to competition as a result of a domestic carbon price, and ensuring that our domestic manufacturers do not face undue competition from foreign enterprises as a result of our carbon tax. And so we're in a carbon tax context here, and one advantage, in my view, of a carbon tax over a regulatory program is you can have these border adjustments, and you do have a vehicle through which you can protect these vulnerable industries. To be clear, this is a very small share of the U.S. economy and a small share actually of traded goods in terms of the value production. So that narrow category of goods, and now it's beyond the scope of this discussion to talk about the various design mechanisms, but the basic idea is to have an import duty on these carbon-intensive goods coming into the United States and an export rebate for those same goods as they leave the United States to foreign markets. And so the exact design and magnitude and eligibility of these adjustments is going to be important. I think that's still kind of in the research area of exactly how you would do it. But I think for those industries, it's a big deal. So they would feel like this is a critical part of an overall carbon tax policy. I think from a purely macroeconomic standpoint, it's not that big a deal, but I think we really do need to be mindful of the concerns of those industries. And I think it's feasible to do carefully circumscribed adjustments for the products I'm talking about.
Nick or Phil?
So I just know that this is a personal question for Doug with border adjustments. He wrote a lot about kind of the virtues of having a tax base that is more in line with where we're actually consuming our goods. I think Adele has it right. This is a complicated issue. It seems like an attack on energy-intensive industries here when you say, okay, we're going to have a carbon tax, but we're not going to pay attention to Chinese manufacturing. But when we actually dig into the numbers, the carbon content of our imported goods is not a huge amount. So I think this is a very important political dynamic because you really can't get a lot of political will behind a revenue neutral carbon tax or a lot of climate policies if you don't address the international issues. But it's also one where how efficient it is, it's hard to see exactly how much emissions we're going to save.
I would just add that the first best is having global action on climate change, right? So we're worried about competitive effects. They're a direct result of disparate policy ambition. So the first best is for us to leverage our policy into vigorous diplomatic engagement with other major emitters and our trading competitors and partners. Then, once you've done that, the remaining issues are what you address with your border adjustment.
I would just say, obviously, all of that is much easier said than done when you have a Paris Accord that's non-binding and you have a number of countries that really roasted the United States for intent to withdraw but are looking like they're failing to meet their targets because a lot of their low-hanging fruit policies are already in place and now they're going to have to make difficult decisions about policies that are more costly and have diminishing marginal returns in terms of GHG reduction. And so I think that's a complication. You've had a number of reports that have shown that China has lied about their CO2 emissions, so there's a whole new level of transparency that needs to be addressed on something like this. And then again, something I mentioned earlier, I think you're introducing a whole new level of bureaucracy over what is ostensibly the more efficient policy that I think is ripe for rent-seeking and fraud for opportunities with fraud and addressing where in the supply chains you actually implement some of these taxes. When you have goods that are produced all over the world and manufactured all over the world, trying to pinpoint where you should actually adjust those prices through tariffs and other price adjustments, things get very complicated pretty quickly.
Two-part question. When Ocasio-Cortez made the claim about 12 years and then we're out of time, it sounded like hyperbole. Was it? And if it is or isn't, how do you get the Chinese or others to buy in to a global approach to this at a time when the whole world seems to be rejecting globalism and becoming more border-oriented and nationalistic. Nick?
Yeah, I think it was a bit hyperbolic, but I don't blame her because she pulled that from the supplemental UN report that said we need to act in that time frame. But I think part of the problem in the discussion over climate change broadly is these doomsday scenarios that are essentially fat tail scenarios that are less likely to happen but have pretty catastrophic results. And you see that with different representative concentration pathways and estimates of what greenhouse gas emissions will look like into the future, what those costs could ostensibly be. So I think if you're looking at a low probability, high risk scenario, I don't blame AOC for saying what she said. That said, I don't think it's accurate, and I don't think that's necessarily where we're going to head based on global emission trajectories. So again, I think it's more focusing about how you can have broader cooperation among energy technology trade that allows places like China and India to develop their economies to meet increasing energy needs while also addressing emissions, whether that's smog-forming emissions, which we've seen that China does not have a proclivity to address either. And it makes me skeptical that if a country is willing to let their citizens breathe dirty air and drink dirty water and throw a lot of plastic into the ocean, that they're going to be concerned about CO2 emissions. That said, I think if you can provide affordable, clean, reliable energy, then you start to make progress on a global scale that might actually mean something.
So I think Adele really hit upon the core of the issue, which is getting this to be an economic international discussion and not just a climate international discussion. People are very focused on climate and some difficult collective action problem, but it's not the first international collective action problem we face. We've done this with chemical weapons, we've done this with nuclear non-proliferation, and while I think climate change is a bigger lift, you look at the successes there and you start off with a more broad consensus, and then you kind of drill down into getting to the specifics and the trade-offs and getting some kind of bilateral agreements. So if you look at nuclear arms reduction, big international agreement, everyone says, okay, we don't want to have more nuclear weapons, and then you get Russia and the US having SALT, START, and these other agreements. So when we think about Paris Agreement, that was great for getting everyone to say, okay, we're going to agree on how we're going to measure emissions and sort of where we think we're going to go. I've written about my qualms with the US's commitment because I think it was not in line with what other countries were proposing. But the basics of just having the sort of idea of like, yeah, let's all agree on how we're going to account for this is a good starting point. And we should then think about what is the next point. How are we going to get China or Russia or India or any other country to agree to make some kind of trade-off in tandem with us?
I would just point out that, we keep positing this scenario where we're doing a bunch of stuff and other countries are not, and we're trying to, hector them about taking action. Actually, the reverse is true. I mean, a lot of countries around the world are, like China's experimenting with cap and trade for emissions, and they're taking actions that we're not. So I think we need to kind of temper this, the U.S. is going to be out there in front of everybody. That might have been the case, 10, 20 years ago, but it's not the case now. I do think Nick is right, is that there's a gap between the Paris commitments and what countries are actually doing, the policies are actually adopting. And I think that's a lesson for us. Like, if we're going to make a pledge and it's going to be credible, we have to have the willingness to put the policies behind it that actually achieve those goals. And we've got to hold others to that kind of credibility standard as well. And that's why, in part, I think it's really important to get the economic ministries and the finance ministries as part of that conversation, because it brings the economic discipline, the economic reality of these commitments into the establishment of these targets. And divorcing the policies that you're going to adopt with the targets you're going to take, I think that creates some of this gap that Nick was talking about. So we need to keep the conversations really real and more concrete, in my opinion.
Help me understand if I hear correctly. So we withdrew from the Paris Accord, and yet we're on our way to meeting our targets well in advance of other countries which stayed in the Accord and are not.
I would re-characterize this. So the United States took a target for 2025 of 26 to 28% emissions below the 2005 baseline. Other countries took their own targets with their own formulations. You have to be kind of careful when you say, okay, we're X% of the way to our target, because some of that achievement was done without any policies. So don't just think that current trends are necessarily going to continue in this linear decline and then suddenly, lo and behold, we're at our target. We're at the phase now where if we were going to hit that target, we absolutely need new policies. And state-level policies are not a substitute for broad economy-wide federal action. And I would say other countries, so if you want to see a modeling exercise, we just put out a modeling exercise of the Paris Accord and the targets, and we modeled everything. We show, the benefits to each, region in participating in the agreement. I think our target is very doable still at this point, but we have to have a policy, and I think a carbon tax of $25 per ton of CO2 and ramping up gradually over inflation would be very consistent with our Paris target, and we showed that in that multi-model analysis I referred to earlier.
I was just going to say two things. One, there's exogenous factors that play into this too. I mean, our emissions may be up in 2018 when those numbers come out because we had colder winters and so people were using more energy, and so GHG emissions might actually be up. But I think what the problem with Paris, in my standpoint, is that everyone kind of hailed it as this kumbaya moment between the developing countries and the developed countries, and I just did not see it that way. I think if you've got non-binding targets, that doesn't mean anything. In the nationally determined contributions for a number of these countries, they effectively said that, hey, addressing energy poverty is more critical for us right now, so we're going to continue to build more coal. We're going to use what makes economic sense for us, and we foresee our GHG emissions rising exponentially as a result, and then maybe we'll come to the table. So I didn't really see Paris as this global defining moment that the rest of the world saw it as. And in that regard, I still think there's a huge divide between the developed and the developing world when it comes to any type of action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Do either of the three of you have a question you'd like to ask your co-panelists before we take another question from the audience? Anybody else have a question in the audience? In the back?
Hi, could anyone on the panel identify any proposal, anyone in the world to propose a tax on carbon as it appears on the periodic table of the elements?
So generally the way we formulate carbon taxes, and it's really shorthand for tax on the CO2 emitted when a particular fossil
So it's a carbon dioxide tax, not a carbon tax we're talking about?
So
Okay,
yeah.
why don't we call it that? I'm just curious.
I usually call it a greenhouse gas tax, a carbon excise tax. There's a one-to-one, there's a linear relationship between the carbon content of a fuel and the CO2 that is emitted when it's combusted. So to me, it's a matter of semantics. I don't care what you call it. It's an excise tax on the emissions that would derive from the combustion. I think it's like a little silly to make like a big deal of this.
Carbon sounds like something we don't like. Carbon dioxide is a basic input and output of all life on the planet. That's a difference, I think.
Well, it's the CO2 in the atmosphere that adds to the radiative forcing of the greenhouse gas concentration. So you're right, it's the CO2 that we care about in the atmosphere, but it's derived from the carbon within the fossil fuel in its chemical composition.
There was a question over here. Over here.
It seems obvious from the panel, thank you very much for being here, but obviously there's some economic challenges and some political challenges with getting to a solution. You keep going back and forth on that for certain. we talk about reducing the subsidies to large corporations that are still emitting too much. And we talk about making sure that we're pushing new technologies into the forefront. But what I haven't heard is how much are we spending on, or are we willing to spend on new technologies in light of what the cost is for not doing anything? Because, and I heard, I've heard from, the 12 years we're all gonna see something terrible to, there's gonna be a number of deaths, but what I really don't see is anybody coming to an agreement on what is the true cost. And if we had that in front of us and then we said, well, let's balance that with how much we're willing to subsidize in terms of new technologies, we might have a better argument. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that it's a different panel that provides the narrative of the actually quite scary prospects of a disrupted climate. I personally am not the right person to comment on that narrative, but I'm extremely motivated by it. And that's why I'm spending my career thinking about ways to mitigate those damages and avoid those really quite disturbing potential outcomes. Where I think the conversation is going to go in my profession, like in my world, is going to be around, well, what are the economic implications of different policies? And so what we're seeing in our analysis, and this is not just our model, but like across the modeling community, the analytical tools we have brought to bear, we're looking at even fairly ambitious levels of abatement policy gets us to the GDP we were gonna get to in 2030, maybe 3 months later, 6 months later than we otherwise would. Okay, can we take a 3-month delay in our achievement of a GDP level in 2030 to avoid some of these drastic, nasty, expensive, damaging outcomes? I think that's a bargain, frankly. I mean, I can't quantify what those damages are. I'm not the right person. But I can quantify what the economic implications of trying to avoid them are, and I find them very reasonable.
Sure. Well, I think the other part of this question is, what are the climate benefits of these policies? I mean, you could have a cost of inaction trajectory, whether it's costs of extreme weather events, costs of rising sea levels, whatever the case may be. But if you're spending all of this money to transition to whatever the case may be, if it's 100% renewables or if it's an aggressive carbon tax, I think you need to look at what is the climate benefit of those policies. And I go back to the fact that if the US is really acting alone here, you're not changing that climate trajectory all that much. So you're still going to see those extreme weather events, and you're still going to see the rising sea levels. A lot of these policies based on modeling from the model to assess greenhouse gas induced climate that was based upon a model that was developed with funding from the EPA said that you could enact these policies and the US could reduce their emissions to zero, and you would only avert about 2 centimeters of sea level rise and 0.2 of a degree Celsius. So I think, as Philip mentioned, and as Dr. Morris mentioned, this is a collective action problem if you want to talk about it. And so you need to think about what is the US doing, but what is the rest of the world doing, and how do we measure the climate costs versus the climate benefits?
So I'm going to take the classic easy road out on a problem like this, which is revenue neutrality. So when we think about carbon tax, kind of the idea of how much we're spending is really the difference between the old tax system and the new tax system. So that definitely has opportunities for going off the rails, but it also could stay the straight and narrow and say, okay, we're going to be disciplined, we're going to use the revenues wisely, and it's not really going to have a huge budgetary impact, if any at all. The other aspect in terms of the innovation, like how much should we subsidize these technologies, or how much should we spend on R&D? I'm again going to take the easy route out and say revenue neutrality, because the Treasury shows exactly how much they're expecting us to lose in tax revenue from tax breaks. I believe the energy for the next 10 years, energy tax breaks are $90 billion. Most of that is PTC, ITC, these late stage, already mature technologies that get subsidized. So that's a good place to start, to think about, okay, if we actually want more innovation, what can we pare back that we have right now and we don't like, and how can we steer that into a more competitive, more neutral policy scenario?
Okay. I want to just jump in on the point of R&D. So let's look at ARPA-E. That's one of the flagship Department of Energy energy R&D programs. So its funding is about $370 million a year, okay? U.S. private R&D by companies is $458 billion a year. So I'm convinced that, yes, you might need these targeted government programs, but there's absolutely no substitute for channeling $500 billion in U.S. R&D each year towards a cleaner economy. There's if you're not harnessing the profit motive, the R&D incentives with a price on carbon and other greenhouse gases, then you've got both your hands tied behind your back, because there's just never going to be enough federal money that would be equivalent to that.
Nick, you get the last word.
Well, I would just say, I think there's fundamental problems when the government sets out to commercialize a specific technology, because inevitably that tends to fail. And ARPA-E is a pretty good example. I mean, this program was put in place to spend money on what was supposed to be kind of pie-in-the-sky technologies that the private sector would never undertake. And then later you find out through a GAO study that, actually some of these companies and projects had venture capitalist backing before they actually got ARPA-E grants. And that's the whole, I think, problem, is the incentive structures are wrong, that they want to funnel money to things that actually might be economically successful, so the member of Congress can go to a ribbon-cutting ceremony and say, hey, I helped create these jobs, when it's really just some sort of incremental reform. And so when I look at innovation at our national labs, I tend to think of what President Obama talked about, and he talked about the internet and GPS all the time. And if you look at the funding that went beyond those technologies, it wasn't to create the internet and GPS, it was for defense purposes, it was for a government objective that the private sector was not undertaking, and commercial entrepreneurs saw an economic opportunity, and that's why we can get from here to the Chipotle in a more time-effective manner. I think that's what we need to have at the national labs, something that allows the government to conduct that basic scientific research, not solely focused on energy, and allow the private sector more access to what's going on in the labs. So if they see something that's commercially viable, they can go in and look at it and transform that into whatever they think might be an economic winner. That's the model that I think that has proven to be successful in the past, and I think there's too much of a siloed funding approach and too much of a return to, I think, the government-owned, government-operated model. Even though they're government-owned, contractor-operated, I think the contractors have less flexibility, the lab directors have less flexibility, so I think we need to open up the labs and give them more autonomy, while at the same time making sure that we have strict transparency and oversight so they're not being frivolous with taxpayer dollars, which can be a pretty fine line to bridge, I think, for policymakers and for appropriators. But I know, in speaking with some of the lab directors, that they certainly feel hamstrung by some of the decisions that policymakers make because of the incentive structures that are currently in place.
Philip Rossetti, Nick Loris, and Dr. Adele Morris, thank you for joining us, and thank you.